Every month, I looked forward to my copy of Boys Life magazine arriving in the mail. Back then, I lived overseas, so it usually was delivered right at the beginning of the month and not in the middle of the previous month. I couldn't wait to read about Scouts in action, check out the jokes section for my yet-to-be-born stand-up comedy career, and I scoured the advertisements for sea monkeys, BB guns, and other cool stuff I'm sure I just couldn't live without. I learned Scout skills and about cool adventures through the pages of Boys Life. It was also a connection to something much bigger than me and my friends in our pack and later my troop. We'll learn more about the history and significance of Boys Life, now Scout Life magazine, in this edition of Artifact of the Week. With the Scouting movement's introduction in 1908, Scouting began to spread across the globe, with many independent troops and national and state-based organizations popping up in the United States. The YMCA was working hard to promote the idea of Scouting in the United States when William D. Boyce incorporated the BSA in February 1910. Together they partnered along with Daniel Carter Beard and Ernest Thompson Seton to flesh out Boyce's BSA organization. On a similar path, you could find the American Boy Scouts, founded by rival publisher William Randolph Hearst, the Rhode Island Boy Scouts, and the New England Boy Scouts, both of which broke off from the American Boy Scouts in December of 1910, along with groups like the Order of the American Boy, which was sponsored by the American Boy magazine, all competing to become the predominant player as a youth organization. From the very beginning of the BSA in 1910, it was obvious that the organization wanted to not only meet the outdoor needs of American boys, but also wanted to help shape their minds as well. Part of this effort involved one of the first programs of the BSA, an organization-wide reading program designed to direct Scouts to literature and publications that were considered appropriate and effective in developing leadership and citizenship. A magazine was at the heart of this early desire, but the cost of starting and publishing a monthly publication prevented the BSA from simply jumping into the magazine business. The BSA was also limited in what it could do, as they were also trying to establish the organization, recruit members, publish a handbook, and a myriad of other projects the fledgling organization needed to quickly accomplish. As I mentioned, there were other publications available, such as the American Boy magazine and Work for Boys, already promoting Scouting and boys activities. But these were at best shared promotions and, according to some sources, included conflicting information and created confusion over what each organization actually stood for and what they were doing. On January 1st, 1911, a new 8-page publication hit the streets. It was called Barton's Boys Life. The magazine was fairly large, 11 by 15.5 inches. It was 8 pages, with each page featuring 5 columns, and the magazine contained, according to founder, publisher, and editor George Barton, as much reading matter and more illustrations than any 5-cent weekly contains. It's reported that 5,000 copies of the January edition were printed, but very few of them made it to the public. So who was George Barton? George S. Barton was from Somerville, Massachusetts. In January of 1911, he was in his 30s and an adult leader with the American Boy Scouts, a rival scouting organization sponsored by newspaper publisher William Randolph Hearst of California. In a March 1st, 1943 letter from Barton to Irving Crump, then managing editor of Boys Life magazine, Barton writes, "In 1911, being young and having a little money, I decided to start a boys magazine on somewhat different lines to the somewhat staid monthly publications and to the nickel novels. The Boy Scout movement seemed to me to offer a field for such a journal, as I was much interested in the American Boy Scouts and had written several articles for Hearst Boston American on the subject." I believe this letter was written by Barton to set the record straight. You see, in 1935, James E. West wrote a pamphlet about the magazine's history, erroneously giving credit for the creation to another individual. Boys Life came into existence originally because of the vision and ambition of a young man, Joe Lane, at the time 18 years of age, who was interested in the Rhode Island Boy Scouts. Joe Lane, moved by an inspiration unusual in one of his age, saw in Scouting opportunities for the development of a publication that might ultimately become a vital factor in the life of a vast audience of boys. So he started Boys Life in a very modest way. Indeed, our magazine with its first issue was scarcely more than a pamphlet and had only 6,000 circulation. In perfectly good faith, this young man assumed to call the magazine the semi-official publication of the Boy Scouts of America and the official organ of the Rhode Island Boy Scouts. This error has been repeated repeatedly by BSA, using printed materials and talking points over the years. So how did Joe Lane's name enter the conversation? Joseph Lane was in fact an 18-year-old Boy Scout from Rhode Island, but he belonged to the American Boy Scouts, not the Boy Scouts of America or the Rhode Island Boy Scouts. Barton hired Lane in early 1911 to serve as advertising manager and assistant editor for Boys Life. In a February 27, 1942 letter to Crump, Barton wrote, "Joe Lane had absolutely no financial interest in Boys Life outside of a promise of stock in the company if things went well." In the March 1, 1943 letter to Crump, Barton wrote, "I was employed in an engraving house at the time, and the magazine seemed about to take up more time than I could afford to put in, so I got in touch with an artist friend, one Frank Lane, who had a young brother, Joseph Lane, who was very much interested in amateur journalism, and took him in with me to handle advertising and general detail work. Joe was all right, and he did a fine job with me." Joe Lane's name appears in the March 1st issue as the advertising manager and directs inquiries about advertising to him. Knowing that Barton, not Lane, was the founder and publisher of Boys Life magazine, how did the BSA come to buy the magazine? Well, this is another story that has often been repeated but is full of erroneous information. As I already mentioned, the BSA was interested in developing the whole boy, physically, morally, and mentally, and to accomplish this goal, the editorial board and the publications department of the National Council were created. In March of 1911, the BSA declined to acquire the magazine Work for Boys from William Byron Forbush. Forbush was associated with the American Institute of Boy Life and the Knights of King Arthur, a church-based boys club. There was no reason given for declining this offer. A year later, in March of 1912, the BSA Executive Board decided not to accept an offer from William Boyce to fund a BSA Youth magazine for 3 years, because in the judgment of the Executive Board, publication of the magazine should be under the immediate close supervision of the executive officers here in New York, and that would be impossible if the magazine was published in Chicago. The minutes of the Executive Board's April 1912 meeting show the first discussion of purchasing Boys Life magazine. The Executive Board did not want to spend or encumber operating funds to buy Boys Life, but empowered the Committee on Magazines to purchase the magazine through funding secured via a publisher or by deferred payments to the current ownership from proceeds generated by the magazine over a 5-year period. At the May Executive Board meeting, the board voted to approve the purchase of Boys Life at a price not to exceed $8,000 and to obligate the payment of $2,000 within 6 months and pledge the magazine as security for deferred payments. On June 10, 1912, the Executive Board of the BSA met, and the minutes of the meeting record that after careful investigation, agreement has been entered into for the purchase of Boys Life magazine for $6,000. $2,000 to be paid by November 1st, $2,000 to be paid within 12 months from June 10th, and $2,000 additional within 18 months from June 10th. The minutes also note that the magazine committee directed Mr. West to proceed with publication of the July number and outline plans for securing advertising material, which would take care of the expense of the magazine. The sale of Boys Life to the BSA was announced in the June 1912 issue. This magazine has been purchased by the Boy Scouts of America. Commencing with the July issue, it will be published under the direction of the Executive Board of the Boy Scouts of America, 200 Fifth Avenue, New York City. The announcement goes on to say, "The marvelous growth of the Boy Scout movement in this country has made it necessary for its executives to plan for an official publication. In response to an inquiry recently sent to 7,000 Scoutmasters asking for suggestions as to what national headquarters might do to help them in their work, a large percentage urged on an official publication." As we just learned, Boys Life was purchased for $6,000 to be paid over 3 installments. Over the years, this price has been tied by officials of the BSA to the number of subscriptions the magazine had at the time. The story goes that at the time of purchase, Boys Life had 6,000 subscribers, essentially paying $1 for each one. This is where the math unravels. In his March 1st, 1943 letter to Crump, Barton writes about the January 1911 issue. "Very few copies of the paper in the form of the ones I sent you reached the public, some 5,000 if I remember correctly. Does this mean 5,000 were printed or 5,000 were distributed to the public? Well, that's not certain." In August of 1911, Barton wrote in his monthly column Round the Campfire, "Boys Life is now selling each issue over 35,000 copies. Just think of it, 35,000 eager and anxious boys watching and waiting for the magazine every month." By January 1912, Barton reported they started with 25,000 copies and are now up to 65,000. In the 1914 report on Boys Life, the Boy Scout magazine, which represents the performance of the magazine in 1913, Frank Presby of the BSA's editorial board wrote, "It is gratifying to report that the records over the years show over a 300% increase in the number of subscribers. 50,000 copies of the January number were published and circulated. Now, if we use the 6,000 subscriber figure historically recognized by the BSA at the time of purchase, then the number of subscribers would now be about 24,000. Additionally, the total number of magazines printed, 50,000, would be 15,000 less than reported by Barton's 65,000 when the BSA bought the magazine. Looking at the 1915 annual report, Presby writes, "Since our last meeting, the actual paid circulation has more than doubled, and we are now printing and distributing more than 60,000 copies each month." Again, these numbers don't add up. Doubling the paid subscription would give us 48,000 subscribers, and the total number of magazines printed would still be below the reported high water mark by Barton. The 1916 report, giving us data about 1915, was also written by Presby and says on January 1st, 1915, Boys Life had 36,730 regular subscribers, distributing a total of 50,000 copies each month. Again, these numbers just do not fit with any of the earlier reported circulation data, so it's safe to say there is no direct relationship between the price the BSA paid for the magazine and the number of subscribers the magazine actually enjoyed. While these facts may clear up many of the misunderstandings that have been communicated about the acquisition of Boys Life by the BSA, let's take a look at the January issue and the March issue a little more closely. The January 1st magazine was 11 by 15.5 inches and was 8 pages long with 5 columns per page. Barton called the magazine Boys Life with a subheader of 5 cents, Boys and Boy Scouts magazine. Within its pages, readers found several self-contained stories. When the blockhouse was besieged, and the almost human elephant, for example. The first installment of a serialized story called For His Vow's Sake. There were features like Things All Scouts Should Know and Around the Campfire. And there was a featured article edited by Baden Powell, the founder of the World Scouting Movement. The news section of the magazine provided stories about the Scouts, troops, and activities of the American Boy Scouts and the BSA. The January issue mentioned the formation of the New England Boy Scouts and reprinted an article titled The Boy Scout Movement Invites Union, which encouraged a merger of the ABS and the BSA. Knowing more about the January 1st issue, how did it compare to the March 1st issue? The seeds of this answer can be found in the January issue when Barton announced that Boys Life magazine would increase in size and quality. Barton did a reboot of the publication by adding to the staff and enacting changes to the publication. By the time he was done, the new Boys Life looked radically different, both in size, format, and content. Barton wrote in his March 1st, 1943 letter to Crump, "So I became more ambitious, and on March 1, 1911, another number 1 went on the newsstands." This explains why both the January 1st and the March 1st issue are labeled as Volume 1, Number 1. It also helps explain why Boys Life and the BSA routinely refer to the March 1st edition as the first issue, and why, to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the magazine, published a reprint bearing the following statement on the bottom of the cover. "Reprint of Volume 1, Number 1 by Boys Life in celebration of our 50th anniversary." A couple of final notes before we wrap this story up. In July 1911, Barton hired Jack Glenister, famous as the first man to swim the Niagara Rapids, to serve as treasurer and as a swimming writer. Seeking funding for the magazine, Glenister introduced Barton to Mr. Fay, an orchestra leader from Providence, Rhode Island. Mr. Fay and Glenister helped Barton form the George S. Barton Company and transferred ownership of the magazine to this new entity. Mr. Fay advanced funds to the new company, and by August 1911, Glenister began to offer common stock at $10 a share, a move that went unnoticed in the financial world. As the BSA was considering purchasing or starting a magazine, one thing was very clear. The magazine had to be self-supporting and could not draw funds away from any other parts of the National Council's operation. By 1928, magazine sales grew to 225,000 annually. The Great Depression took a bite out of these numbers, and in 1932, the single issue price was cut from 20 cents to a dime, and the subscription dropped from $2 a year to $1. Troops were offered incentives that discounted the annual price down to 75 cents if they could get at least 10 scouts to subscribe. While James West believed in the value of the magazine and the Scouts reading program, and often spoke on its value as a tool for leadership and character development, he also knew he needed to guarantee his advertisers a monthly circulation of 300,000 to maximize revenue. To help keep circulation up, he introduced the 100% Boys Life program in 1933. The idea was simple. Any troop where every Scout family received a subscription to Boys Life would receive a large felt pennant to recognize this accomplishment. The program proved to be successful, and the 300,000 figure was reached in October of 1935. While circulation numbers remained fairly consistent and constant over several years, promotional distribution kept the number above that 300,000 threshold. In 1937, the first Boys Life Week was celebrated, and an annual promotion of subscriptions as a Christmas gift was introduced. In 1939, Boys Life circulation figures were added to local councils' annual performance goals. The format, content, and look of Boys Life changed over the years, and in 2021, the magazine's name was changed to Scout Life to reflect the addition of girls to Scouts BSA troops. While the story of Boys Life and Scout Life magazine may not have been consistently reported over time, it is without a doubt one of the true success stories in the publishing world. When Barton started Boys Life in 1911, he had two stated goals. First, he wanted Scouts to have a magazine they could call their own. Second, he wanted to give boys a publication which they will not be afraid to have their parents see them reading. To that end, Barton was a success, and the magazine has continued to be an important and pleasurable addition to many young people's lives. Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Join us next time as we continue to learn more about the history of Scouting America through the collection of the National Scouting Museum and Artifact of the Week.